Hi, my name's Jackie King from King's Automotive. Today we're going to be installing a Pure Stage 2 turbo on Tom Gorelick's F30 335. We're also going to be installing a TurboSmart dual port diverter valve, the Pure Turbo inlet, Dorsch Stage 2 high pressure fuel pump, and a Fuelit Stage 2 low pressure fuel pump. At the same time, we're also going to be doing a bunch of maintenance items like the oil pan gasket, motor mounts, all that stuff while it's out, common BMW wear and tear items. Thank you to Mike at Extreme Powerhouse for working with Pure Turbos to get everything wrapped up and expedited and sent over to us so that we can install it this weekend.
You have no idea how happy I am to see these packages. Thank you very much.
We're going to begin the job by disconnecting the battery since we will be touching some electronically sensitive components. Disconnect the negative terminal. Should just be a 10mm socket, and throw a towel over the hood, the trunk latch over here so that it can't actually shut and lock us out. Let's start by taking off all of our zip ties from the abuse over the years and a bunch of 8mm to drop the underpan to expose the subframe. Make sure to get the genuine BMW zip ties to properly secure your undershield back on. After the under tray, we're gonna start by taking off the center reinforcement plate, a bunch of 13 mils. Got a couple more 8 mils to loosen from the center support. Got some slight leakage going on over here. Disconnect the oil level sensor. Usually not part of the turbo job, but since we are going to be dropping the oil pan later on, just want to start doing some preliminary work while we're here. We're going to drop the car down a little to take off the wheels. Now that we've taken off both wheels, we're going to start disconnecting all the control arms, basically everything attached to the subframe. We're going to get ready to drop the subframe. After we undo all the control arms, we're going to drop the car back down, brace the engine, so once we take out the subframe, the engine doesn't fall on us. We'll start by removing one of the control arms. Should be 18 mil on both sides. On the driver's side, you do have to be careful for one thing that the passenger side doesn't. It's the headlight level sensor. It's just unclipped, so you could just pry it free with the screwdriver. Usually for organization, I just like to thread the bolts back in. Next, we're gonna take out the tension strut, 18mm bolt as well. Let's repeat the procedure on the other side. On the cars that have more of a complete undershield, there's usually going to be something blocking it here. Most of the times you'll end up having to remove part of the liner to be able to get to it, but we have the modified undershield over here. Thanks to the city of New York. The longest bolt ever, dude. After undoing both control arms, we're going to work on the steering gear a little. Start off by disconnecting this electrical connector. Should be a locking tab. Just push it outwards, and after you undo a locking tab, press the connector down. Might be a little hard. What I find that helps is to push the connectors in while pulling on the release tabs. That way you can get the tension off of the release tabs. There we go. So on this connector, you just have push tab here, just pinch it. You might have to pinch it a little hard. With this, you have the locking, so you just push it out. And then you should be able to press down the center black piece, and that should release the connector. Next, it's just held in by a bunch of push-in clips. Get a cat's claw tool, it should all come right out. Now that we have the connector off to the side, we can go ahead to loosening these two steering gear bolts. We have a total of 4 E14s. We got 2 in the front here, 1, 2, and there's gonna be 2 hiding in the recess of the subframe. Give it a wiggle to see that it's free. We're gonna loosen 2 13s on the side of the subframe. These 2 13s go through an aluminum bracket in the front of the chassis that help brace up the subframe, so we'll remove those. We got a couple more subframe bolts to go. We gotta brace the engine, undo the sway bar link. Subframe should almost be ready to come out. We still have the motor mount bolts to do as well. To drop out the splash shield, it's mostly all 8 mils, and you have one of these weird 10mm nuts in the back. Oh yeah. We're gonna go to removing a sway bar links. We've got a 17mm nut and a T30 counter hold in the center. There's some tension in the sway bar link. You could just pull down the bar itself, relieve the tension off the link, and it should pull right out. Thread the nut back on for good organizational keeping, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. We're gonna disconnect some of these hoses up front for coolant. One of them already got disconnected. This just pulls back. You have these metal clips inside that just clip on. Pull it back gently and it should pop right off. We also have 2 plastic pop rivets that we're gonna pull out to release this plastic hose from the subframe. Very easy step to skip. You'll most likely crack your plastic pipe if you do skip this step. That's a piece that's only available from the dealer, so you're probably not gonna be too happy about that. Get the cast claw out, pop off these rivets, and then we're going to move on to the motor mount nuts. If you're doing a turbo and you're dropping a subframe at the same time, you can drop the downpipe to make it easier to get to this top bolt. If you have a flex head ratchet, you should be able to get to it regardless. Right on top, 16 millimeter. I use a 3/8 shallow here. So right now we're going to disconnect the O2 sensors so that we can remove the downpipe so that we can get to the top nuts on the exhaust mount. We have an aftermarket strut bar on this. The hardware is usually a 13 to remove if you have a bar, but the hardware that came with this kit was 14, so just gonna take that off. While we're up here, we're just gonna go ahead and brace the engine first. So the proper way to support the engine is we're gonna take the tow hook that BMW gives you and right in the side of the cylinder head next to the oil filter housing, we have a threaded portion. Just make sure it's in there pretty good. We're gonna set this up on the unibody of the car. Don't be tempted to go on the fender, you'll probably crush it. I usually just like to tighten this up until I feel a considerable amount of tension. That way we're gonna pick up some of the slack when we drop the subframe. We're gonna get to removing a downpipe. It's gonna be a 16 millimeter socket to remove the clamp. Then we're gonna spread the clamp open. It's gonna be held in there pretty tight from the tension. There she goes. Now that we have the lower clamp undone, we're gonna move to the clamp up here. It's gonna be a 13 millimeter bolt to release the upper clamp. After loosening the 2 clamps, we're gonna loosen the bracket that holds on the downpipe. After we undo the 2 bracket nuts and the upper clamp, I'm actually gonna tap the upper clamp a little just to get it to break free. To help with the removal of the downpipe, we're gonna loosen the bracket in the back here to allow the pipe to drop down a little. These 2 should be E10s. We're also going to remove the entire bracket for the stock cat. It should be 2 E14 bolts connected to the transmission bell housing. Mechanic. Once we have the bracket loose, we're gonna give the upper clamp a couple more taps to free it. If you find that it's not coming loose, you might just have to loosen up the clamp a little more. Once we got the clamp freed, the cat should come right out. And now that we have the downpipe removed, we're gonna move on to taking out the motor mount nuts. Again, that's a 16 millimeter socket up top. Oh, that thing is fucking seized. So we ran into some issues. The 16 millimeter on the top of the engine mount decides it wants to break free from the engine mount and just free spin. The workaround for us is going to be just disconnecting the motor mount bracket and seeing where that takes us. My only fear is that the motor mount bracket sits directly above the axle housing and it might not give us space to drop it down. So the motor mount brackets and block bolts are going to be a couple E14s. You're gonna have a total of 4 of them. Okay, then the other side is gonna be the 16 mil. So we can get straight to just a 16 millimeter nut on top. All right, I think this housing is actually gonna interfere with the bracket. So what I'm gonna do now is we're actually gonna undo the axle, take the axle out since we have to do that later anyways for the oil pan. Unbolt this housing from the oil pan, and then it should come out and give us enough space for the whole subframe to come out. So the axle nut is actually gonna be an axle bolt on these. It's a 17mm Allen key. Luckily for us, we already disconnected all the control arms, so it'll give us enough space. Once you undo the nut, we could tap out the axle. Some oil might come out actually, so just prepare a drain pan. Striking the pry bar usually helps. It's held in by a circ clip, so once you see it move initially, it should come out pretty easily the rest of the way. So for those that don't have experience with BMW passenger side axles on X-Drives, they're awfully long because the differential is actually on the driver's side, and this axle has to go through the center of the oil pan in order for it to spline in to the diff. So when we're actually hitting the base of the flange to get it separate, we're actually trying to release this C-clip from inside the diff on the other side. You just look to take a rag, wipe this down so we don't make a huge mess everywhere. And we'll set it to the side. Now, once we have the axle out, we can now separate the axle housing from the side of the oil pan. 4 13mm. Once you have the 4 out, this is actually just held in by an O-ring, so give it some light outwards pressure, and the whole housing will come out. Again, we'll wipe it off to keep everything clean and set it to the side. Once we have the motor mount undone, we got the axle housing out and the motor mount bracket here undone. We're gonna undo 2 T30 screws that bolt the fender liner to the side of the subframe. And then back on the driver's side, there's gonna be the same bolt in the same location. We're also going to undo the headlight level sensor connector over there, since that's bolted to the side of the subframe as well. The sensor can stay with the subframe, but we don't want to yank out the connector as it's coming down. The good old tri-state rust, baby. That's our own Loctite, man. Custom Loctite. Here we have the same bolt. Oh, this one has way less Loctite on it than the other one. And then we're also going to undo the headlight leveling sensor. One place to watch out for is we probably will get hooked on the sway bar, but we're just gonna try to angle it and maybe maneuver the steering gear out of the way. But now that we have the 2 T30s and the headlight level sensor disconnected, we're gonna go and loosen the subframe bolts. You're gonna have a total of 4 E14 bolts. You're gonna have 1 here, 1 in a recess of the subframe over here, and then 2 on the other side in the same locations. So you have 1 over here, and then 1 over here. And then under the fender liners back here, you're gonna have an 18mm bolt, 1 here, and another 1 on this side, and the subframe should be ready to come out. So we're just gonna get to removing it. We're gonna break them free by hand first and then gun them out. Breaking them free by hand first is just to make sure that they don't snap on us. Oh, I knew it. We got one more fucking thing up here. Once we have the subframe out, we're just gonna angle the sway bar out of the way. And voila. Not very fun. Pizza time. Now that we have the subframe out, we drop the car back down. We're gonna start undoing the connector for the wastegate solenoid, and then we're also gonna remove the heat shield that exposes the top bolts that hold in the turbo. Here you have 1 connector, you just push down, pull it up, and it comes free. And you have 2 10mm nuts, 1 on the top. The 1 on the bottom is covered by this cable, which we can just unhook to get out of the way. Feel for the bottom one. And then we'll disconnect the vacuum hoses that go to it at the same time. So we'll start working on the heat shield, and there's gonna be 3 bolts, 1 in the center, 1 in the rear, and 1 in the front, towards the front of the car. They're gonna be T30s, so put this out of the way. Just gonna have a T30 bolt. There's gonna be 3 of these. Should I start crying?
Should I?
Correction, there's actually 4 bolts. For us, this 4th one is actually turned into a 10mm. So we'll see what's going on with that. I do know that the turbos were replaced on this car at some point in time, so maybe the hardware was also replaced. Yeah, definitely replaced hardware. Take out your 4 bolts and out comes the heat shield. Just throw that back on so we don't lose anything. Now that we have the turbo heat shield removed, we're gonna work on the intake to expose more of the turbo. We got 1 connector for the MAF over here, 1 clamp to loosen. Now that we got the intake out, we're gonna undo the PCB connection up here at the valve cover. It's 4 tabs. Don't be surprised if one of them breaks, but obviously do your best to be gentle with it. Lots of practice of breaking them. There's a connector here. We'll undo that. Then we are going to raise this back up to take out the inlet and then the outlet pipes. And that should help us expose more of the turbo for us to start removing it. Now that we're back underneath the car, we're gonna start by taking out some of the coolant hoses. So here's one that connects to the back of the water pump. You can just take all these off with a flathead usually. Disconnect the coolant hose on the side of the water pump. So the hose that runs to the side of the water pump is actually attached to another coolant hard pipe that feeds into the turbo. So we're gonna undo the clamp there as well. And after we undo the clamp there, the clamp up front, we're gonna unbolt these 4, I believe, E10s from the block, and we're gonna pull out the whole coolant hard pipe. So the 4 bolts that hold the hard pipe to the block are actually E8s. Just gonna undo these 4. There's also only 3 bolts, not 4. So. A little stubborn. I'm gonna drop the car down a little once we get this hard pipe out. Separate it from the 2 hoses. So now that we got that coolant hard pipe out of the way, we're gonna move on to the turbo outlet pipe. Just pull on this clamp, this will come out. Another clamp on the turbo side. A little bit of a tighter spot. Try not to get coolant all over yourself. If you are doing this at home and you're on jack stands, I do commend and applaud you, but should anyone need a shop, you can find us at J King's Auto on Instagram, or at 172 Glenwald Avenue in Bloomingdale. You can do this job without removing the entire subframe. Personally, since we have the lifts, I do think it's easier to drop the subframe. And since we're also doing the motor mounts and the oil pan, as you can see, we have a slight leak here. It was easier to just drop the subframe and hit everything all at once. Now we have the outlet pipe out, we can work on removing the inlet. After removing the outlet pipe, we're gonna remove the inlet pipe. For us, it's a 8mm clamp or a flathead. It's gonna undo the clamp, just wiggle it off a little. After releasing the 2 pipes in the water pipe, we're gonna undo the turbo oil return line. We have a T30 bolt on the side of the block over here. We're just gonna pry on it a little. Sometimes this hose will be sweating because it's a rubber hose with a crimped on clamp. If you see that sweating, you're probably just gonna wanna go ahead and buy a new hose. We're also gonna undo the electrical connector for the diverter valve. Same style connector as the wastegate. It's just gonna be one of these push-in springs. Now we're gonna drop it back down to take out the inlet pipe totally so we can expose some of the hardware up top. So now that we're up top, we're gonna disconnect our PCB pipe from the inlet so we don't break it. Pretty fragile piece. We got a flathead connection over here. Again, this is on the MST pipe. The PCB over here. The inlet comes free. Now that we have all this space for activities, The turbo oil feed line is actually right under the exhaust manifold over here. You're gonna have to dig your hand in there. We're not gonna be able to show you on camera, but it should be a T30 bolt. Once you take that out, you can pop off the hard line. So once we get the hard line off, we'll show you guys what we're talking about. We're also going to start removing the turbo manifold nuts. It's going to be an 11 millimeter. So we're just going to go along the top over here. So for the top nuts, you're definitely going to want to go from up top. Then you're going to have a couple from the bottom that you're going to have to get from the bottom, obviously. Here's what they look like. Should be an 11 millimeter brass. So pretty intuitive. If you have the old turbo, you can kind of just match up the flanges to note the spatial position of them, and then you'll know kind of where you need to be. After we've disconnected the T30 up top for the coolant pipe, we're also gonna disconnect this T30 for the oil pipe down here. You probably wanna wiggle it loose at this point because now we're gonna start dropping the exhaust manifold. Just careful of oil. So once we've taken out all the exhaust nuts, we're on to our last one. Oh. Here we go. Pretty heavy. Definitely don't want to drop this on yourself.
PSA for a Pure Stage 2 upgrade. Make sure when you take off your wastegate actuator that you lube it up, because this could happen to you. And then you're shit out of luck because BMW does not sell these separate. I just have to get a used turbo just so I could take the wastegate actuator off of it so that we could reuse it. Can you actually mount it top mount? Because I want easier access to it.
Yeah, dude, no problem. The exhaust would face forward.
Right, which is different. Yeah, it's like, I want to be in C mode. Go ahead.
oil through?
Get the oil going, yeah.
It'll let off.
No blue smoke.